So I wasn't actually planning on buying a Switch 2. I had it pre-ordered back when it was announced. I was lucky enough to get a pre-order, but I decided to cancel it because I didn't feel like the value proposition was there. I'm not a huge Mario Kart guy. I do enjoy it, but that was pretty much the only sort of new game that was on the Switch 2, right, at launch. But a couple of months have passed since the Switch 2 launched, and there's now at least one more game out for it, which is Donkey Kong Bonanza. And, you know, I love 3D platformers, it's one of my favourite genres, and I really wanted to play it, but I still kind of held out. That was until I really got the urge to replay the Switch Zelda games, specifically Breath of the Wild. I recently replayed Ocarina of Time and I absolutely loved it. It got me really wanting to play Breath of the Wild again. So I really thought about it, and yeah, I ultimately decided to get a Switch 2. I've spent the last few days playing with it, and I actually have a lot of thoughts, hence why I'm making this video. This isn't like a full-on review. There's been so many YouTube videos of people reviewing this console. That's not what I'm doing personally. I just want to talk about it. So I just want to give a bit of backstory about my experience with the original Switch. Yeah, I mean, I loved it. I thought it was a great console, but there were some issues with it, and there were some issues that I noticed right off the bat, right? The first one was the build quality, but the fact that the console was so underpowered was really starting to become a problem. I mean, I'm pretty sure the chip that it was using was like 5 years old at that point. So obviously by the time that the PS5 came out in 2020, the Switch was just like incredibly underpowered. So fast forward to 2025 and the Switch 2 comes out. Again, it's using an older chip, but the difference this time is that technology has come so far now where it doesn't really matter that much the specs, because it's using things like DLSS and it's got the capability to use ray tracing, I'm pretty sure, and all of these things. So the actual power of the console compared to the Switch 1 is a bit more in line with the current gen. Yeah, I think that power-wise, the Switch 2 is definitely there now. Another thing that really stands out about the Switch 2, especially compared to the Switch 1, is the build quality. And I mean, this thing feels solid, and you can kind of feel it flexing a little bit, but compared to the Switch 1, where the Joy-Cons would rattle about constantly, it's really sturdy. It's a really solid console, and that's obviously down to the magnets on this thing. It's just so satisfying when it clips on like that. It's awesome. The whole thing it feels more like one cohesive unit this time, and I think that is also down to the colour scheme, the Joy-Cons being the same colour as the actual console itself. The only drawback for the build quality of the Switch 2 is the fact that it's still using a plastic screen, and genuinely I have only had it for a few days, but I do have a glass screen protector on it now, but for the first couple of days I didn't. And I've actually noticed that there are some micro scratches on the screen already, which is just crazy. The Switch 2 is still having these issues with scratching. I think it's down to the dock, because the scratches on the screen are like straight line. The Switch 2 has a 7.9 inch screen, so it's actually more comparable now to a Steam Deck in terms of its size, which is crazy to even think about. But unlike the Steam Deck, the Switch 2 is very, very thin. It's about the same thickness as the original Switch, right? It feels a lot nicer to hold, in my opinion, than the Steam Deck. Bear in mind, I do have pretty huge hands anyway, which was another issue with the original Switch, where my hands felt kind of cramped trying to use the Joy-Cons and stuff. But the Switch 2 just fits really well in my hands. I'm not really having any problems. I know that some people have complained about the lack of grips and stuff, but I've not even really considered buying grips for the Joy-Cons because it just feels really good in my hands. I do think that the Steam Deck is a little bit more comfortable, even though it's heavier than the Switch 2, and that's just because of the ergonomics of it. The Switch 2 is significantly more comfortable to use, for me at least, than the Switch and the Switch OLED was. And obviously with that bigger size, you get the much larger screen, and Nintendo decided to actually do something very un-Nintendo-like and actually make a pretty competitive screen. So we are back to an LCD display. It's now 1080p, 120Hz, with HDR support, and with VRR support, which is that's a pretty high spec screen. Some people have said that they've experienced like motion clarity issues, and I do definitely think that it's there. But when you're in motion, when you're actually like playing the game, playing a fast-paced game like Mario Kart, for example, it's really not noticeable. I genuinely cannot notice any kind of ghosting or anything like that. So I'm not really having that issue. Another point of contention for some people is the fact that it's now using a 1080p screen rather than a 720p screen. I love that decision. It definitely drains the battery life a lot more, but I think that for the games that support it, you are going to really want that higher pixel density, especially when we're now on an 8-inch screen. So getting that higher pixel density is definitely going to be worthwhile, in the long run when we get these Switch 2 games. Now, obviously, Switch 1 backwards compatibility is another issue, and yeah, there were a lot of games in portable mode that were sub 720p. So now that we're scaled up to 1080p, there is going to be a lot of like blockiness and everything. I did test the Switch 1 game that is a native 720p. I tested this visual novel Clanad, which runs at a native 720p. I don't know if it was the best example to test because it scales really, really well. Like, it looks pretty sharp, and that's with like a lot of text and a lot of character sprites which are rendered at 720p. There's no aliasing or anything like that. In the game itself, it does actually have an anti-aliasing toggle, but even with it off, it looks super sharp and detailed still. So yeah, even if you're blowing up a 720p image to a 1080p image, it actually looks pretty decent, at least in that game. I really don't have any issues with the display. I know that some other people are, and again, I'm not technical enough I don't even have the equipment to like sit there and count all the pixels or anything like that. So take that with a grain of salt. This is just my experience, but I love the screen a lot, and I'm actually using the Switch 2 portably a lot more than I thought I would. I thought that I would just keep it in the dock most of the time. But let's talk about the dock itself, right? So the dock, again, very un-Nintendo-like, actually has 4K support, which is pretty strange for a Nintendo console to actually have 4K support. It's like they're finally in 2018, right? I was a little bit worried because I knew that it was Nintendo and I knew that there were going to be drawbacks. So it does technically support HDMI 2.1, however, it's not like full HDMI 2.1 features. So whilst the screen on the Switch 2 itself does support VRR, it doesn't support VRR when you're outputting to another display. So that's one thing. It does support full RGB 10-bit HDR, which is pretty cool. I like that. However, it doesn't support 120 FPS or 120 Hz refresh rate at 4K when docked. So that's what I mean. It kind of feels like it's somewhere in between HDMI 2.0 and 2.1. It's pretty finicky to get like 4K 60 with 10-bit RGB. Like it's a bit difficult to get that working in HDMI 2.0. But then obviously HDMI 2.1 supports all of that and 120, but then the Switch 2 doesn't. So it's somewhere in between. But that's not really a huge issue because even the PS5 and the PS5 Pro by extension does not support the full HDMI 2.1 capabilities either. It's limited to, I think, 32 gigabit per second, whereas HDMI 2.1 is of 48 gigabits per second. And what that means is that when the PS5 is using 120 Hz, it actually decreases the resolution down to, on my display, it reduces it to 1080p. So yeah, even on the PS5 Pro, you're not getting 4K 120 HDR VRR. So it's not really a huge issue. I'm actually pretty happy with the display output. A cool thing about the Switch 2 is that it supports the original Switch's Pro controller, but it's got this weird issue where the Pro controller can't wake the Switch 2 up from sleep. You actually have to manually turn the Switch 2 on when it's in the dock using the power button on the Switch 2. It's not a huge deal. I'm not lazy enough where, I sit down on my sofa and I'm like, I can't deal with this. I can just get up and turn the Switch 2 on. It's not a big deal. But apparently that's something that the Switch 2 controller can do. So there's actually a cool feature if you go in the accessibility options to like make the text look bold which I think actually looks better than the normal text. But yeah, I mean, let's talk about the games themselves. So far, I've played 3 Switch 2 games. I've played Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, and the Switch 2 edition of Breath of the Wild. With Breath of the Wild being the main reason why I purchased the Switch 2 to begin with, I'm actually really impressed with the visual upgrade. I know that some people were saying that it's not really worth the 10 quid. I didn't pay the 10 quid, I actually paid for the physical Switch 2 edition of the game. I bought it sort of in a bundle with the Switch 2. And I'm really impressed with the visual clarity of this edition of the game. Obviously, it's not a native 4K. I'm pretty sure it's like a dynamic display resolution from between like 1080p to 1440p, and then it's outputting at 4K. It looks great. It looks really good, especially on my screen. There is a lot of aliasing, but the improved textures, the improved draw distance, and obviously the fact that it's now 60 FPS is such a huge improvement over the Switch version, which was like 1080p 30, and it looked blurry, and it was just, it wasn't a very impressive looking picture. And also the HDR support is really good on Breath of the Wild. I feel like they actually did pay a lot of attention to the HDR support. Some things like flames on a fire or the light sources in certain villages and stuff like that look really good. Mario Kart World, on the other hand, also looks really good. It's another game that's, I believe it's using 1440p and then outputting at 4K, which is the same for Donkey Kong Bonanza, but we'll get to that in a minute. And it looks really, really good. It has a lot less aliasing than Breath of the Wild does, but I think that that's just because the geometry is a lot more like round and, there's less geometrical detail or whatever. But I'm especially impressed with the fact that the frame rate is like rock solid, even with the fact that it's now 24 players, actually really solid on a technical level. And the game itself, I'm kind of mixed on it. I feel like 24 players is maybe a little too much. When you're like in amidst the crowd, it's so hectic, you can barely move at all, you can barely make any progress. But when you're like in the top 5 or so, it's kind of like a breeze. You actually are able to race properly. So I feel like there's some balancing issues with Mario Kart World, but I am enjoying sort of doing a couple of races every day. But the main attraction and the main big thing for me was Donkey Kong Bonanza. And I didn't actually buy this straight away because I thought, I'll play Breath of the Wild first. But, I just really wanted to play Donkey Kong Bonanza because I love 3D platformers. And yeah, I mean, I'm blown away by it. I think it's like genuinely a masterpiece. I actually kind of enjoy it more than I enjoyed Mario Odyssey. The sort of destructible environments, the level design, the abilities that you unlock, the fact that the bananas themselves actually serve more of a purpose than Mario Odyssey because you put them towards like skill points to upgrade your skills and stuff like that. It's an incredible game. There are frame drops, especially when you're destroying a lot of things at once, and especially during boss battles. I think the frame rate just like caps itself to 30 FPS, but it's really not a huge deal because the game itself is so much fun. That brings me back to the question of, is it worth buying a Switch 2 right now? And I'm going to say maybe. And the reason I say maybe is because if you missed the Switch, if you missed the original Switch, you didn't buy one, you have like such an insane back catalogue of games that you can play. And this is kind of the case for me as well, because like I said at the start of the video, there were some issues with the performance. So there were actually a lot of Switch 1 games that I just didn't play because the performance was really bad. Like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, I never played that because I saw how bad the performance was, and I just knew that I couldn't do it. So I'm actually excited to check those games out now that they have a Switch 2 version. And there are a lot of other games like Metroid Prime Remastered, for example. I just never got around to playing that. The Luigi's Mansion games, I never got around to playing them. So there's a big back catalogue of games that even I am excited to get to. And the fact that I now have it just feels like a really solid console to play on compared to the Switch 1, which again, the Switch 1 is an amazing console, but it just had a couple of issues that I couldn't look past. So if you're in the same boat as me where there are games that you didn't play or you just didn't play any of them, then yes, the Switch 2 is a great value proposition. If you're coming from a Switch 1 and you don't have any other games consoles or a PC, so you can't play games like Hitman and Cyberpunk and Hogwarts Legacy and all of these games, then yeah, the Switch 2 is going to be a pretty huge upgrade for you coming from the Switch 1. For me personally, I do have a PlayStation 5, I do have a PC. Yeah, the Switch 2 is going to be my indie game / Nintendo console / maybe the odd visual novel here or there if I'm feeling in the mood for a visual novel. It is expensive. It is an expensive console. The Mario Kart World bundle that I paid for was £430. So compared to the Switch 1, which was like £280 I think when that came out, obviously without any games or whatever, but that is quite a substantial jump. Obviously with inflation it's less of a jump, but then you have to consider the fact that the world is currently in a cost of living crisis, so even though with inflation it's better, it's still quite an expensive console. I don't really buy people using that argument. Even with game prices, I don't really buy people using the argument that, oh, with inflation it's better, because, again, there's a cost of living crisis going on right now and people can't really afford to buy games. But yeah, definitely, I would say that so far with my experience, I'm really impressed with the Switch 2. I think it's great. The build quality is fantastic. The games that I have played have been really good, and I'm really looking forward to Metroid Prime 4. I need to get around to playing the older Metroid Primes. But if you're still on the fence about it, still just give it a few more months until there's some more games out for it, I'm pretty sure that there's going to be a Nintendo Direct in September, so we should have a pretty good idea of like the next year's worth of games. Yeah, that's going to wrap it up. I just wanted to share some thoughts that I had with the Switch 2, and if you've bought a Switch 2, let me know how you guys are getting on with it, and also give me some recommendations for like Nintendo games that I should play, because there's loads that I missed from the Switch 1, so I'm really excited to sort of dive in to a lot of those. But yeah, that's going to wrap it up for today. I hope you enjoyed. Please subscribe if you did, drop a like and a comment, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one.